very much for your comments on the presentation. I appreciated your comments on the sovereignty of states very much, because I mentioned with regards to the issue of sovereignty. Before 9/11, there was a growing consensus on the need for cosmopolitanism, on abolition of borders somehow, creating interstate relations, international solidarity, etc., etc. It was progressing to the architecture of international human rights law, for instance. It was going, but it was progressing. And 9/11, that marked an absolute stop to that trend towards internationalism. And obviously, here again, it's been led by the United States, which have retracted in a very narrow conception of sovereignty and of national interest. Now, and you see with both candidates, even John Kerry, he never mentioned, I don't know, the impact that the United States had on the rest of the world. It was only our national interest has not been defended properly by Bush. So it was still the same premise. It was exactly the same premise as Bush, just with different conclusions. So the paradox is, while at the same time returning to a very nationalistic, narrowly patriotic, everything basically I hate about nationalism, about our country, our country, our country. At the same time, so exactly as you pointed out, sovereignty in effect has been eroded and undermined. So while we've had a growing speech about nationalism, in effect it's not playing out, because sovereignty is being undermined on a day-to-day basis. But this is not just due by this effort to undermine sovereignty while at the same time promoting a very nationalistic discourse on the international stage. Is not just the fault of the United States. Every single country does that. And here again, as an international human rights organization, we see it in every international forum. Countries which are, our country, my people, we will defend out till the last drop, etc. And they are the ones who make the worst concessions and WTO and all the possible international forum, but in a forum where the media is not often there, or it's not reported. Then they make all the concessions which really thoroughly undermines their sovereignty. So the U.S. is maybe in that regard, but most countries actually do this double game of playing the nationalist card to the. Actually, in effect, when you see what they do, is they work underhand to undermine the own sovereignty of their country. So in that sense, all governments are culprits.
Thank you very much. We've got now, we're getting comments from the other panel members on two specific issues. One is about embedded journalists. To what extent has it damaged journalism? And the other, Imtiaz Alam's question regarding patriotism. Would you like to begin, please?
I answer to Imtiaz Alam, and I want to take the example of European journalists regarding this issue of patriotism. I think we were vaccinated by the Second World War, and now in France, in Germany, you find the most unpatriotic press, because because now I'm behind the scene, they always criticize government, army, and here we can talk on a general basis. So, because there was this tremendous event of the Second World War, it's now 50 years that it's difficult to find patriotic journalism, even if we had the war in Algeria. But the press has done a very good job in the 60s during the Algerian war. And so, but the reason why we are unpatriotic, it is because there was this catastrophe. In America, I think they never had such a catastrophe, and they were confronted for the first time. There was Pearl Harbor, sure, in December '41, but they never see foreigners coming in America since the war in Texas, since in the mid 19th century. That was the first time that foreigners came in New York, in the World and attack the World Trade Center, and they are confronted to this fact for the first time. So we need to have that in mind, that you cannot say journalists, they have to be skeptic, they have to be watchdog. If you don't integrate this reflection in your mind, if your country is not confronted to such an event, you cannot predict what will be the result.
The first question, what do you mean by patriotism? And there's always people confuse it when, about this policy of the government and the interests of the state. In fact, for example, are you unpatriotic when during the height of Kargil war we wrote about that it was a misadventure? I think probably at that point, when we wrote this article on the great Kargil debacle at the height of Kargil conflict, and we were labeled by the administration as anti-state. But in the hindsight, if you look, actually, that was the right thing to do. Because if a country, you jeopardize your national security by conducting those kind of misadventures. So similarly, actually, during when the 1971 war, when Pakistani troops were carrying military action in Bangladesh, there were so many people who were courageous and to write about against it. So at that point, there were actually, I know actually many people, many of our colleagues were arrested and put under the defense of Pakistani rule just because they were opposing the military action. But what was it a patriotic step? No. I think one should be very, very clear about it. And in this country, we tend to confuse the state policy, the government policy, and the state. So probably that's one of the reasons why. Like similarly, actually, when I gave this example of the writing about the military and the power and perks, actually the House of Military has taken over everything in this country. Is it unpatriotic? But definitely by the establishment standards, unpatriotic. I think probably that's journalists should be very, very clear. Either they want to follow the establishment line on the pretext of being patriot, or they want to be an objective journalist. Thank you.
By that last intervention, because it relieved me of the responsibility of saying some of the things that I was going to say. I must say, when I felt that all of us up here were in such furious agreement, perhaps it's a journalist in me, but I really feel the need to disagree with much of what's been said. With the greatest respect, I think there's a lot. No one's harder on journalists than themselves. We're all sitting around here being very critical of journalists in ways that we never would be externally, and I think it's one of the great things about journalism. Although I do think we sometimes beat ourselves up a bit too much. Well, let's look at the Iraq War, and let's look not at what we think about the Iraq War, but let's look at the way the media covered the events surrounding the invasion. I think the media, right around the world, did an outstanding job of covering the facts of the invasion. I think you can't just say, oh, well, there was a problem with embedding. Yes, there were restrictions with embedding, but we weren't simply relying on embedding for our facts. The facts that came out about the war came out from three sources. They came out from embedded journalists, including the embedded journalist who just exposed the killing in the Fallujah mosque. It came out from journalists getting official briefings from the coalition forces, and it also came from independent journalists working within Iraq, including independent news sources such as Al Jazeera or Al Dubai, or Dubai Television. People like John Lee Anderson, John Burns, Paul McGough, American and Australian journalists who really told us more about what was going on within Iraq, inside Iraq, and as a result of the war, and since Iraq, than anything else. So I think it's important we try to separate our feelings about the war itself and the way it was covered. Yes, there's much to be critical about it, but overall, I think journalists did a pretty good job. And when we look at the work that was coming out of Iraq by people like John Lee Anderson, John Burns, Paul McGough, who now can't get back into Iraq because of his exposure of the the criminal past of the current Iraqi leader. Add to that the work done by people like Seymour Hersh. Frankly, my friend, I have to say, I think it's nonsense to say that any media organisation who had that story to suggest they would have sat on it defies everything we know about journalists. I can't imagine any media organisation who had those photos or those tapes, that information sitting on that story. I cannot believe that for a nanosecond. And I don't think any of us really can believe that for a nanosecond.
No, I'm sorry, just because there was a report I have read in the paper that what I'm saying, that some of the information were available, some of the photographs were available to the media, but it was never used. That it's not out of hand.
Yeah, I think it's known that there were a number of journalists chasing the story before it was finally broken. Look, the final point I want to make is about the concept of nationalism. I think it's a very important one. And can I say, with the greatest respect to my friend Bertrand, I think what you said about the European media is rubbish. I think what you said about the European media is true of every media around the world that operates in a free society. That is, when it is internally within its own society, it is incredibly unpatriotic. It is critical of its government. It is critical of the things its government does. The moment a national media turns its face to the world, whether it's the French media or the British media or the German media or the Pakistani media or, let me say, the Indian media, the attitudes taken to the world are profoundly different to the attitudes they're taken within their country. And we all know this as individuals. All of us sitting at home in our own country, talking to our countrymen, will say things about our country that we would not dream to say to foreigners. I will say things at home to other Australians about Australians that you would not get out of me with torture in this room. And all of you are honest, are in exactly the same position. And our media reflect that natural tendency to, yes, be critical among ourselves, yes to criticise our own government nationally, yes to criticise what our government does, but to be, I think we are unnecessarily critical of American media because we know what American media does, and no one really knows what we do. We are all much more exposed to American media than we are to media from any other country other than our own. In some cases, we're probably more exposed to American media than we are to our own. But it is actually, I think, to wind up on this point in defence of the American media, because this is a point that's come up a bit. I think it's just it shreds ambiguity to describe the American media as somehow in any way uniform, or to characterise the views of even one organisation like the New York Times and the coverage of one organisation like the New York Times on the basis of the work of one reporter, Judith Miller. The American media is a large, diverse, different points of view. Parts of the media are, even within the United States, grotesquely sycophantic to the views of the government. Other parts of the American media are incredibly and continually critical of the American media.
Even the American print media, far more than the networks do. But I just want to say a few words in relation to what Anne had spoken about earlier. This session is called Media and Reconciliation. I think for many Pakistanis, and here we come to this issue of patriotism and what Rita was saying also, for many Pakistanis, there is an enormous question mark about reconciliation with India. And that is that can a military regime, with which, after all, we have lived with military regimes for 25 years, but do we trust a military regime and a military ruler who refuses to take off his uniform to actually make a genuine peace with India? We know that we have lived as a national security state, not just in the last few years, but actually for much of our existence. And when I say national security state, I mean a state which defines its national security in terms of its enemies, not its friends. A state that defines national security in terms, not in terms of the well-being of its people, but in terms of what kind of pressures it can bear, it can bring to bear on its enemies. So if we are a national security state, is a national security state capable willing to actually make peace with the enemy which has propped up the ideology of that state for the last 50 years. And I think this is a very profound question which Pakistani liberals, the Pakistani media, have to face up to. And it's not something that General Musharraf can push under the carpet, as I think that's what Anne was trying to say. These are very, very deep and profound issues. And the jingoism of the president today or other leaders who want to speak, you'll be hearing more of the political leadership tomorrow. And everybody will be saying, peace with India, etc. I think, we have to be much more circumspect as Pakistan. Secondly, I just want to say very briefly that for the first time since 9/11, Pakistani journalists have actually had restrictions placed on them operating in Pakistan. And this is unprecedented. We are not allowed to report on Waziristan unless we, go with the military. There are huge restrictions placed on reporting from Baluchistan, from Quetta, because of the presence of the Taliban in Quetta and because of the sort of semi-insurgency in Baluchistan. This is a very new phenomenon, and again tends to back a lot of what Anne has spoken about. Even in the worst days of martial law, for example, Ziaul Haq, we were not stopped from going around the country and reporting what we wanted to report.
And we cannot dare to meet Dr. Abdul Qadir even.
Well, of course, the nuclear issue has gone totally unreported by the Pakistani press. In fact, that has been outrageous in the sense that American media has more access to our own intelligence people than Pakistani media does. So, there are problems there. Lastly, I just want to make a few. I went to India just now after 12 years, and I was really quite taken aback by many developments and wonderful things that I saw. But I was totally shocked at the print media who have stopped covering foreign news. Indian papers, apart from the Asian Age and perhaps one or two other, Indian papers' foreign page is full of Britney Spears and celebrities. Now, there's an incredible ignorance in, educated Indians about what's going on outside the world, around the world. And I think it's terribly important for India and the Indian media to understand that you are not going to be able to make peace with Pakistan or make peace in the region or be able to move forward in the region unless you understand what the hell is going on outside your own country. And foreign news, I was in India during Fallujah, just before Fallujah, during Fallujah, that's right, in Arafat. And there was absolutely nothing in it about that in the Indian press. And so I think really this is a very important issue that the Indian media should address.
After 9/11, and almost across the board, like the Islamic terrorists, and when we talk of patriot, especially in the Western media, and when we talk of reconciliation, especially in South Asia, especially between Pakistan and India, patriotism, obviously we can have long speeches on that and how the Indian media and the Pakistani media are sort of defending their own government's positions. I just want to raise this one terminology that can any Pakistani mainstream media can use the term terrorist for the people who are fighting in Kashmir, or can any mainstream Indian media can use the term freedom fighter for the people who are fighting in Kashmir? If they cannot use these terms, how can there be a sort of a reconciliation, especially between media of the two countries? That is my question. And can SAPMA play any role in that, making some terminology or something?
Can we coin a new term, terrorist?
I'd like to make a comment about this pressure on people who work for the Western media. I also happen to work for the Western media, and there is a tremendous pressure. They take it for granted that we agree with everything they want us to portray. For example, in this region, a number of falsehoods were spread, and we were supposed to prove that it is true. For example, this matrimonial ties between Mullah Omar and Bin Laden. That Mullah Omar's son had married Bin Laden's daughter or Bin Laden's son had married Mullah Omar's daughter. It was not true, but we were supposed to find it out, and it was being spread by the mainstream Western media. It was reported by the mainstream media. And then, the presence of Mr. Bin Laden and Dr. Zawahiri in Waziristan. And they keep pressuring us all the time that they are there and you must find out. And it's not confirmed. They all say, in general terms, that they are in the border region of these two countries, but not in Waziristan. But they keep asking us all the time that they must be there and you must find out. And then the possession of a nuclear weapon or dirty bomb by Al-Qaeda. That is another, another issue which keeps popping up, and they keep asking us that they must be having this dirty bomb, and it has not been reported in the local media, but it is always mentioned in the Western media. Then the Pakistani restrictions on reporting from Waziristan, they keep telling us that you can go there, but they never allow us a free hand. They arrange these guided visits all the time, but there is no free reporting. And they tell us that this is an issue of national security. That is the term they use, national security. So, we, the local journalists who report for Western media, we face all these pressures from the Western media. And they think that we are trying to hide something. But in fact, we are trying to do our job, but they are never satisfied. That's what Zahid was saying, and what I wanted to support him on this point, that the Western media has these expectations of us which we cannot fulfill because they think that we are trying to hide these things. Thank you.
Just have nothing but appreciation for what Mr. Ahmad Rashid said. Full praise to him, because it's Indian media, especially the self-styled leaders of the Indian media, which tell the world that they are the most liberal and they are the most objective and they are the most investigative journalists. They are not. Just see that how many neighboring countries Indian media has presence. Indian big media houses mint money like anything, but they use money on establishing discourse, establishing semi-pornographic channels, and on other things which have nothing to do with journalism. And those great editors who say that they have been the greatest editors, their objectivity, liberalism, independence, the limit is only up to the limit to which their owners, mill owners or factory owners, they allow. Not beyond that. Just not beyond that. And I think they are pseudo-liberals because they compromise the standards and levels of journalism in India. If they were the leaders and if they were the flag bearers, they should have done something more. I feel ashamed that not only in the immediate neighboring countries, but even in China, in Cambodia, in Myanmar, in Dhaka, those big newspapers who can afford to have their correspondents, full-time correspondents, even they do not have. So I just wanted to congratulate Mr. Ahmad Rashid.
I think a mention was made about the role of journalists during the Civil War. Siddiqui, retired brigadier. That friend made a comment about the role of journalists and the punishment of suffering this death. I was then the chief of the military PR, and I can recall only 3 instances. One instance of 3 journalists being punished. There were Mr. Ayar Rahman, Mr. Hamid Akhtar, and Abdullah Malik. They were editing paper called Azad, and that paper was banned. And through my intercession, they were released and the paper was restored. But this military action in East Pakistan continued for 9 months. Operation Searchlight was launched on the night of 25th March, and it went right to 16 December when the Pakistani forces surrendered. I am very sorry to say, I was in uniform myself, that these 9 months saw the complete abysmal failure of civil society in West Pakistan, and that includes the journalistic community. Not a word, on the contrary. even during the war, which we were losing right from day one, they were expecting us to go right to Amritsar or to Delhi. And when these persons talked, I said something to the contrary. They did not like it at all. So 9 months of this war, 1971, were actually black spot, not only on civil society, which failed completely, but also on journalistic community. Not ever. I've just done a book which has been published by the Oxford University Press, and the name of the book is East Pakistan, the Endgame, and which I have tried to discuss as best as I could, the role of civil society, which my opinion was absolutely wrong.
You've forgotten that period was total martial law, and I think there was a kind of censorship on the press. I'm not saying that this happened, but civil society, there were some courageous people who did fight, and I give you an example. My brother himself, he actually, and there's some other names, there are hundreds of them, who took out pamphlet, and they were put under the martial law ordinance. I was also jailed during that period. And just because of those things, and the civil society, the freedom of press, whatever freedom press we are witnessing for last 15 years, it did not exist at that time. There was some kind of establishment press which was coming out with this report that everything is fine. I think probably I can name the Urdu Digest. At that point, everything is fine in Bengal and nothing is happening. But there were courageous people who did this, and I think that was a martial law period. It was a martial law period, and nothing came out on the press.
That whatever we came to know about Grand Tomo Bay or Abu Ghraib, it was American press which reported. And all those events were properly reported apart from New York Times and Washington Post by Herald Tribune also, which ultimately led to the inquiries in the United States. Therefore, it would be unfair if we brand them or paint them, in Baban color.
And that analysis, I find some problems with some of the analysis. However, that in Pakistan, while I really appreciate the standard set by the speakers about the freedom of press, independence of press, and the journalists' effort to rise above the national institutions and patriotism, I fully. But in relative terms, in Pakistan, if we compare Musharraf regime with Nawaz Sharif's regime and previous civilian regimes, and Jawahir's regime and previous British regimes, how will you evaluate that? I raise this question. It doesn't mean that Musharraf wins on relative grounds. I'm not going to do that. But that has to be taken into account while we work in institutions. The kind of pressure as reflected in her paper on the Pakistani media or civil society, that also shows that how energetically the civil society and sections of media are resisting the pressures. That is the other side of the story. But in the countries where such pressures are not there, the level of...
I think going back to Siddiqui Saab, I think very quickly we need to remind ourselves that when we talk about the reaction of civil society to the tragic and unfortunate events of 71, they follow virtually 13 years of uninterrupted army rule, and I think it is pertinent to review this simply because it has a bearing on the discussion we are having on the nature of the Musharraf regime, because it shows how civil society and the institutions related to it are emasculated in the process of army rule. The block on the flow of information, for instance, did people know what had been happening in East Pakistan prior to the army action and so on? But that's a separate issue. I think let's keep things in perspective and in context as 13 years of army rule. The second issue is, and I think as Riaz pointed out, the issue of taking the composite dialogue forward. Now this is again a paradox, that we see a certain forward movement, perhaps of a qualitatively different kind. Now, whether it goes somewhere or not, whether we can, as Ahmed said, trust any government to push it to its logical conclusion. Now, you can have a very different opinion of whether the army at this point needs Kashmir needs a national security state to maintain its hold on power. You could argue, for instance, that it has now corporate interests and institutional bases that now require, do not require a national security state. So you could argue that yes, the composite dialogue could go forward. You could resolve perhaps what might be construed a principal contradiction in terms even of your own development, in terms of your own direction, and where Pakistan, will be in the next 5 or 10 years, with this direction being sustained.
One on the issue of sovereignty and the erosion of sovereignty, of whether it predates 9/11 or not. Yes, in a sense it does predate 9/11, but there's been a major difference with 9/11 is one, the speech is now different. It's now the nation state and nationalism in its most narrow and dangerous form is being used in public speeches to defend actions, etc. So first there's a change in the discourse and in the public discourse being used at the international level. Secondly, and which is much more dangerous at the international level, is that yes, there was an erosion of sovereignty, Kosovo, etc., but it was always with the instrument of international law. There was a general, universal recognition that international law should remain the structure of the interaction of nation states between themselves. So even if, yes, I'm president of such and such country and I will defend my national security, my national interest, but there was this common understanding that it would always be within the boundaries of international law. Now, what is really dangerous with 9/11 is that now national security can overstep, go beyond international law. And this is what has happened with Iraq, and this is what has greatly frightened us in the human rights community, because basically now they say, if and when we want, when we deem it, when we subjectively as a nation deem it, we will disregard international law under whatever form. And this is why I continue to disagree on Kerry, because Kerry supports preemptive action. He is on the same, he says, yes, we want respect in the world. Basically, what does he want? He wants to be loved. So yes, we want everybody to love Americans, but when you come to it, he says, we will defend national security against international law, we won't allow France to veto, blah, blah, blah. He has exactly the same line. If need be, we will do another preemptive war. And preemptive war is extremely dangerous as to what it means for the whole architecture of the interaction of nation states. First point. And second thing, on what I've said on Pakistan and Musharraf, my point, I hope I made it clear, was obviously not to criticize Pakistani journalists, and who, for many of them, are extremely courageous, and I've been very impressed by the courage and the competence and the professionalism of many of them. Although I must have interviewed, I don't know, between 50 and 60 journalists, not one did not acknowledge that he self-centered him or herself. All of them, every single one of them, one-to-one says, yes, there is self-censorship, and I cannot say this and this and this and this. And the issues that I cannot tackle are this and this and this and this. And they're excellent journalists. But, so my criticism is not directed at them. It was directed at the climate created in this country such that excellent, dedicated, very good people cannot say what they want. Now, as to Musharraf, the benefits of Musharraf as opposed to Ziaul Haq, here again, yes, I obviously agree, and this is for lack of time. I could not, go through the history of freedom of expression in Pakistan. Otherwise, it would have. I think he would have killed me, since I was already taking too long. But obviously, the situation now is free. The situation under Musharraf is freer than under Ziaul Haq. But here again, my standard is not the lowest of the low. My standard is not, he is better than a dictator who basically stifled and violated all human rights you have in the Declaration. So if you're, what is my standard? My standard is international human rights. It is Pakistan Constitution, It is the conventions that Pakistan as a state has ratified. So the situation is maybe better as opposed to dictator, but this is not my concern. My concern is, what has Musharraf done? What has he said? And my investigation was on his tenure, in the close to his 5 years since he what has he said? What did he say he would do? And what has he done? And you realize that in all the fields, be it for freedom of expression, but my investigation was also on women's rights, on NGOs, on freedom of assembly, freedom of association, on his relationship to the religious groups, and you will realize every single promise he made, he reneged, every single one of them. So, yes, he's maybe better than a horrible dictator you had 20 years ago, maybe so, but this is not what we expect, and this is not what we should demand of our governments. And when I say, I obviously say the same thing to the French government when the same thing happens. So I deeply apologize for the lack of historical perspective, but at the same time, if you want things to move forward, one should, instead of saying, well, it's better than before, we should say, well, it still is not enough.
Preventative war is not of nature opposed to international law, but perhaps it's a debate we can have more over dinner. I quickly wanted to respond to the point that the question was made over here is whether the Pakistan media would ever describe the groups in Kashmir as terrorists, or whether the Indian media would describe them as freedom, or would be allowed to describe them as freedom fighters. I suspect, certainly in the case of Indian law, they would be allowed to, but I suspect the answer in India is the same as it is in Pakistan. It would be so outside the frames in which we prepare our media that nobody ever would. More particularly, I wanted to respond to which comes to that question about self-censorship and how we self-censor into our own national frames. I do want to come back to the point that Ahmed Rashid made about the Indian coverage of foreign news, which is also a point made here, because it is true. There has been a real deterioration in coverage of foreign news in Indian media, although you should come from a country like Australia and see how rarely that gets covered anywhere else, except for our cricket team, of course, which justifiably gets enough coverage. But the question we really need to ask ourselves as journalists is, why do we care there is not enough public coverage of foreign news, when we all know in our hearts that our audiences don't care? People are actually not interested in foreign news. All the figures shows that people do not want to read about foreign news. All the statistics show is that when TV news in any country right around the world, other than when there's some big international crisis on, when TV coverage gets to that point in its bulletin where it starts doing foreign stories, which is usually about 10 minutes into a half-hour bulletin, the listenership drops by between 5 and 20%, depending on the day, depending on the country. So I think there's a broader question to ask ourselves, which is, if our role is to serve our communities, how do we get that balance between what we think our communities want and what all the evidence shows they actually do want? And I think that's a really hard question for journalists to honestly answer.
Okay, one last comment, please.
Just a little bit on this. Again, actually, we have Christine has spoken about the press situation. I agree with her. I mean, like, the kind of censorship is a different kind of censorship. Previously, we have seen in the martial law government that there was some restriction. The press laws were there, but this, what we are witnessing, is that basically a different kind of censorship, which I would say. But on the other hand, I will also say that it's very difficult for Musharraf or whoever comes, any military dictator, to reverse the process which had started over the last 15 years. And that process, and Musharraf was not able to do that. Otherwise, I think probably he would have also imposed martial law, but he could not do that.
Process, certainly no quick answers, certainly no quick roadmaps. In fact, there is a mismatch in terms of time frames. One, a very quick time frame desired. Two, that time is a long time. But I still would like to remind us what was flagged yesterday. Rajamohan and Najam Sethi, both of them flagged for us various reasons why the dominant axis of conflict in our region, which is India and Pakistan, have to move towards normalization of relations. And I think those reasons still stand good. What I would like to look at is what has been the role of the media in promoting public opinion in favor of reconciliation. I think today we keep hearing about public opinion is for peace. Politicians invoke it, most of our political leaders invoke it, and certainly public opinion does seem to be, at least on the rare occasions that we do get to hear newsmakers on television, or that we do get to read what the ordinary people are saying. Certainly, there seems to be a public opinion for peace. But that public opinion for peace, I argue, has been forged largely because of people-to-people contacts, people-to-people exchanges. And I suggest that the media here has not, in fact, played a particularly constructive role. In fact, speaking for the Indian media or sections of the Indian media, and there will always be exceptions, very honorable exceptions. Speaking for the Indian media, generally, I think it has lagged behind the popular sentiment that is for normalization of relations. And whereas I would say certainly if Dawn is any indicator, there seems to be much greater sensitivity to promote reconciliation here. Now, one could argue that that is because there is much greater status support for peace in Pakistan than there is for normalization of relations. And I'm putting it all in quotes, than maybe in India. Because, you know, to argue that the media can play a very independent role, I think one has to be a little more critical. After all, what kind of institution is the media? How dependent is it on the state? How dependent is it on big business? There are all kinds of constraints on the independence of the media. So why we are not getting a much more articulate media in terms of pro-peace politics in India may have to do also with the nature of the way that the state looks at the whole peace process. The other thing is that I also feel that, and yesterday we spoke about it, but when it comes to the internal situation, I think the media is extremely vibrant, extremely critical, but when it comes to cross-border issues, it's a question of only taking the storyline from the Foreign Office. I think we have internalized certain dominant security perspectives, and we do tend to, at least the dominant mainstream media tends to project those very statist perspectives. For example, take the Sir Creek dispute, a dispute over a waterway between India and Pakistan, which has also meant that we don't have a defined maritime boundary, and every few months you hear about fishermen on both sides being arrested for trespassing, a boundary that actually has not yet been delimited. Now, you know, you could, one way of presenting it is just by reciting that there is a boundary, but there could be more creative ways of doing it in terms of emphasizing that the cost of conflict or continuing conflict is much greater than the cost or than the benefit from cooperation. And I think that is the bottom line for me, that if we are going to develop into a media that is more sensitive to reconciliation processes, then it's a question of emphasizing, making clear to public opinion that the costs of conflict are more than the benefits to be derived from cooperation. What could the benefits to be derived from cooperation on Sir Creek be? Joint patrolling in terms of pollution. Now, this and protection of mangroves, which are linked with, say, cyclones. Also, oil and gas exploration in this area. It's a different way of packaging the story. It's a way of emphasizing cooperative frames rather than confrontational frames. They exist, but it means much more creative thinking. And I think this is a valid area for journalists to actually act in. Instead of just merely repeating there is a conflict, taking up the issue of the fishermen on both sides being arrested, and often not even exploring the human dimension of it. I think one of the most pernicious aspects of cross-border reporting, and this goes for Indo-Bangladesh, Indo-Nepal, Indo-Pakistan, and even Indo-Sri Lanka, is the dependence on spin stories. Yesterday, Christopher Warren spoke about spin stories. What are spin stories? Spin stories are those based on intelligence information, information which is practically impossible to verify. And yet the storyline, a great many of our stories, particularly stories which have to do with the border, are based on these intelligence sources, sources that we cannot verify, sources that have their own agenda and give us the stories only when we're serving that agenda. I would identify that the most intractable institutions as far as reconciliation is concerned, that is, institutions that are opposed to the reconciliation process, are to some extent, well, to a large extent, the bureaucracy, and the intelligence agencies. And here I would also like to add the think tanks, which have also been spewing pernicious poison in terms of their interpretation. Think tanks whose research, so-called research, is used by journalists as authentic authoritative sources. I'd like to just shift a little bit away from Indo-Pakistan to Indo-Bangladesh, because spin story, you know, it's maybe a surprising thing to say, but I think 20, 30 years from now, probably the dominant axis in conflict, or maybe we'll have two dominant axes of conflict in South Asia. One is more like, one may sadly continue to be Indo-Pakistan, but it is likely also to include Indo-Bangladesh. And this is, I think, an area of very serious concern, and the impact of spin stories on this dimension is huge, because you have today what is happening is what I would call a discursive slippage. Earlier, we only talked about illegal migration. Today, that illegal migration has not only been communalized, but that illegal migration is also seen as potential terrorist and even terrorist in quotes. And this whole the way that the discourse is developed, and on what is this discourse based? The discourse is based on intelligence sources that cannot be verified, who put out that there is this larger script at work which promotes greater Bangladesh and the total destabilization of the Northeast. Yes, there are very real concerns of demographically fragile areas in the Northeast being overwhelmed. Bangladesh says there's no migration. India, or certain political leaders in India who have held authoritative positions, have said there's 3 million Bangladeshis in India. Total mismatch. And what does the media on both sides do? It produces, on the basis of official sources and intelligence sources, very nationalist frames. They keep repeating that there is no migration. On this side, we say it's 3 million. Of course, there are journalists who have investigated, who have done sterling work on this, trying to see. But also the need to see it in a larger context of why is there this migration? And why is it, in fact, likely to get even worse? Look at the pauperization of Bangladesh in terms of the desiccation, denuding of the delta area. Go back to, in fact, the development policies, go back to the Farakka barrage. I think we need to contextualize and therefore humanize the way that we write the story, the way that we report the story, rather than just seeing them as illegal, convicted Bangladeshis on this side. Then also this whole issue of cross-border incidents. In October, there was recently an incident on the Indo-Bangladesh border. How is it reported? Now, this is a common linguistic area. You would think that they would immediately ring up a correspondent in Calcutta, or somebody from Calcutta would ring up a correspondent in Dhaka. There is no routine or there is no general routine of news gathering of a border incident that would accommodate both sides. Best you would just maybe take a quote from one official on one side and another official on the other side. No attempt to actually get reporters on both sides to write the story. In fact, one of the border incidents I was covering, which was the April 21, 2001 incident, in which 16 BSF soldiers and 2 Bangladeshi rangers were killed, I found the only people who did the composite story was the BBC, Bengali service, and not the Indian press, not the Bangladeshi press. Nationalist frames are reinforced. The only way I think we are going to move beyond reinforcing confrontation and conflict and promote some, or at least begin to seriously engage with issues of why conflict is more costly and why coexistence would be of greater benefit, is if we can transcend some of these nationalist frames. Sri Lanka, let me just, recently we've inked a defense understanding. It's not a defense agreement, but a defense understanding, and which has implications for the kind of support that we would be extending the Sri Lankan government against the LTTE. Now, this has huge implications. Has there been real active debate on this in the Indian press? Certainly not the press that I would read in Delhi. Maybe the southern press, but the Hindu, which sets the agenda for a lot of our understanding of Sri Lanka, hasn't yet carried a very vibrant debate on this. What is the importance of a vibrant debate before we commit ourselves to this kind of militarized support? I think it's very visible in Nepal. On the issue of Nepal, India has committed itself to an all-militarized support to Nepal. There is, it's a support that strengthens the king in Nepal, it strengthens the Royal Nepal Army in Nepal. It's a support that hasn't actually even been discussed in civil society. It's barely been discussed in the media. These have long-term implications. Surely, after the IPKF operation, the misadventure, these are issues that are important for civil society and the media to engage with before we get locked into a confrontation from which there is going to be an extremely bloody return. So I think I would say that there is a vacuum of this kind of real needed debate. Now, as far as Nepal is concerned, let's look at the media within Nepal. And here, it's very much a Kathmandu-based media. It's a media which in many ways is very courageous. I mean, Bangladesh and Nepal probably are very much in the first 10 list of countries that have had the largest casualties in terms of journalists killed covering conflicts or covering, political situations there. And so I'm not minimizing the risk that journalists run in these countries. All I'm saying is that the whole labeling of the Maoists as terrorists, in quotes, on what basis has that label been given? The media, without the minute, even before the state of emergency was declared in Nepal, the media started calling them terrorists. India called them terrorists before Nepalis did. The US called them terrorists. Is that why the Nepali media tamely called them terrorists? Of course, subsequently they were called terrorists by the government. Then, when the peace process started, that terrorist label was shed. Now it's back on again. I think we need to, the media needs to maybe grapple with this a little more. We need to also grapple with how loosely how we use words like arrest and extortion. Now, if the Maoists control 60% of the territory of Nepal, as is often claimed, and they run people's governments and so forth, I'm not saying legitimize them. They are a rebel party. They are not, they don't have belligerent status, though there was a time when they almost acquired that belligerent legal status. But when we as journalists use the word abductions for what the Maoists call arrests, and use extortion for what the Maoists call taxation, I think we need to be a little conscious about that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use these words, but I'm saying that we need to also engage and see what is happening in the areas that the Maoists control. Is it just coercive military force that is keeping the people under them? Is it the gun only? Is there any kind of ideological support? Are politics in control or only the gun in control? These are issues that we need to grapple with if we are going to actually be constructive in terms of the way that we approach resolving the conflict. Just to talk in terms of we are pro-peace doesn't take us very far unless we explore and demonstrate that there are options. Finally, I want to end on the note of the regional media. Today we have, at least sitting in Nepal, I can watch all the Indian channels, I can watch NDTV, Star News. There is in a sense a media community that is cross-border. So you also get a lot of the newspapers on both sides. It's not a two-way flow because there is no. I think there is a huge Nepali diaspora, so perhaps there is even a two-way demand that is happening because there is an Indian company that is invested in a Nepali channel based in Kathmandu. But in Pakistan also one can see many of the Indian channels. I don't see many of the news-based channels, but that is possible that the cable operators have to fill, maybe there's some constraints and so forth. But the point that I want to make is that you would think that if there is a regional footprint, if there is regional media technologies and economies that are making for cross-border audiences, there would be greater sensitivity towards each other's concerns. But yet, if we look at, whether we look at Kargil, or whether we look at a situation in a recent situation that took place in Nepal. There was a blockade in August, a blockade by the Maoists of the Kathmandu Valley. And this blockade was a fairly serious blockade, but the Indian media parachuted into Kathmandu, and particularly television media. And this was just the first day of the blockade, before it actually even began to bite. The Indian media, and in a sense, if you did a comparison of how the Nepali media covered the blockade and the Indian media, nationalist frames. In the sense, the Nepali media tried to downplay the blockade. And I'm talking about dominant media. Of course, there were sections that were quite different, and some very fine coverage as well. But the dominant media on both sides did it in nationalist frames. One downplayed it. The Indian media chose to hysterically hype it. People watching Star TV couldn't believe it, that the reporter was saying that he's living embattled, under siege. People are, almost starving. They're unable to go out. They're terrorized. One of the, I think one of the ironies and perhaps tragedies of this conflict is that in Kathmandu, life is relatively normal. And it continued to be normal all throughout this blockade, which actually was not a very long blockade. The Indian media put out a sponsored report. I mean, when I say sponsored report, it quoted some intelligence source, high-placed intelligence, high-placed official source, not intelligence source, saying we could do bread bombing of Nepal. This is the first or second day of the blockade, before anything really happens, and you're already talking about bread bombing of Nepal, of Kathmandu. And if many of you may recall, in the run-up to the 1986 Indo-Sri Lanka peace accord, there was aerial dropping of food packets, which was a highly controversial move by the Indian government, followed by, of course, the IPKF operation and so forth. And so bread bombing, in fact, and it triggered off all these resonances in the Nepali media. The story was retracted and it was disowned, but the fact is it was not an innocent story. So here you have this hysterical hype of a city under siege and desperately in need of support, and people in Kathmandu watching the Indian news channels as well as reading some of the Indian papers, totally amazed and not regarding this as a particularly innocent mismatch in terms of experiences. So the point is that the regional access to cross-border audiences of a regional media certainly doesn't seem to have led to greater sensitivity. On the contrary, it seemed to have reinforced the bitterness amongst the Nepali, amongst the people in Kathmandu of India's bully, in India not understanding us, India being totally insensitive to us. I don't think I need to dilate on the way that the Indian media covered Kargil, and the fact that much of this was being read as well as seen across the border in Pakistan, and yet it didn't produce any kind of greater concern or sensitivity. So sadly, I am ending on a negative note about the whole question of regional media technology as well as regional media economics, not particularly encouraging for producing a greater sensitivity about cross-border audiences' concern. The last and final point before I leave is, this whole issue, and SAFMA needs to be congratulated for being put on the agenda, the possibility of the media being an actor in promoting reconciliation. Now, many of us here might look at it in a slightly uneasy way. I mean, after all, is the media supposed to be propagandist for peace, or is it supposed to do its professional job of fair and accurate reporting? And here, in a sense, there is a dilemma, but I think it's a false dilemma, because the media is always choosing sides. In the way that we put our stories together, we are choosing what to ignore, what to include, what to highlight, how to place it. So in a sense, we are choosing, we're already exercising judgment. The argument is that can we exercise judgment in favor of promoting a politics of cooperation rather than confrontation? Thank you.
We welcome Foreign Minister Khurshid Kasuri to the third session of our Conference on Media and Reconciliation. I must admit, quite frankly, that the support we have been getting from the Foreign Minister, who has been steadfastly supporting us in our initiative, perhaps at one point of time single-handedly. And I must congratulate him on for his efforts and the result we got yesterday's session, when and he will not be facing the dilemma anymore, which he faced during SAPMA India's reception in New Delhi, when Mr. Natwar Singh announced in presence of Mr. Dixit that New Delhi will be relaxing visa regime for the Pakistani journalists. Yesterday, when we raised this issue before President of Pakistan, General Pervez Musharraf, he responded very radically in support of opening the free movement of journalists from all over South Asia to Pakistan. I hope that his ministry will not sit on the interpretation in the negative side, and rather expand the scope of what the President had spoken yesterday. He was very clear that the journalists from SAARC countries are welcome to Pakistan, and they will be able to move to whole of the country, and a visa regime not specific to cities will be issued. And I'll further interpret the way we had proposed to him, and he had no objection to that, and he did not put any rider, that a whole country, multiple entry, non-police reporting without recourse to investigations by hundreds and one agencies, visa will be issued to the journalists from the member countries of SAARC. He was especially kind to the members of SAPMA, but we are just not fighting for the rights of the member of SAPMA, we are fighting for the rights of the media community. So we don't want to become a privileged group of people who will have this facility. We want for all journalists with 3 years experience in the field, and they should have a free access to each country and have a visa, multiple entry visa. I hope that Foreign Minister will formulate it into a policy